You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hi, everyone. This is Scott. If you want to learn about the world's oldest civilizations, find out how they were rediscovered, follow the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra's descendants over 10 generations, or take a deep dive into the Iron Age or the Hellenistic era, then check out the Ancient World podcast. Available on all podcasting platforms, or go to ancientworldpodcast.com. That's the Ancient World podcast.
This is Jeff Stein, the host of American Carnage, a new American history podcast which debuted with the epic story of John Brown, told across 5 episodes. If you want the deepest dive anywhere about how one old man and his ragtag army changed the trajectory of all of American history, you're going to want to check us out. You will learn everything you ever wanted to know about John Brown and his role ending the most evil institution in the history of the country. Find American Carnage wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. This time, I was joined by Mark Stille, the author of Midway, the Pacific War's most famous battle. This is the second time Mark has appeared on the podcast. I interviewed him last year for his book Leyte Gulf, A New History of the World's Largest Sea Battle. And this time, we're here to talk about Midway, in which Mark wants to shed some light on one of the most famous battles of the Pacific War, maybe one of the most famous naval battles of all time, the Battle of Midway. Without further ado, let's jump into the interview. So the Battle of Midway took place about 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. But even in that short time, the two navies and the overall situation in the Pacific was changing pretty rapidly. Could you talk a bit about how both navies had spent those 6 months?
Yeah, I sure will, Wesley, and thank you for having me back to talk about Midway. I know people are usually quite interested in that battle. So, like you say, it was a busy 6 months between Pearl Harbor and Midway. As far as the Japanese were concerned, Pearl Harbor wasn't their main effort. It was actually an effort to secure the resource areas of Southeast Asia. So they sent most of the combined fleet to do just that. So by the first week of March, they had secured all of the Dutch East Indies, as well as British Malaya. They had knocked out Singapore, and they had completed their main goal in what they called the first operational phase of the war. But then some problems began to occur in what they called the second operational phase, because there were two entities vying for control of Japanese naval strategy. In normal times, the Naval General Staff would have been responsible for formulating Japanese naval strategy, but these were not normal times because Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who was the architect of the Pearl Harbor operation and head of the combined fleet, he thought he should be in charge of the formulation of Japanese naval strategy. So after things went so well in those first few months in the first operational phase, the two sides began to bicker about who would direct the second operational phase. Before that happened, though, there was an event of significance that's been largely forgotten. So the same carriers that took part in the Pearl Harbor raid, they supported other Japanese offensives between January and March, but then in April, they were sent out to the Indian Ocean for a large-scale raid against the British Eastern Fleet. And there was no major naval battle during this raid, so that's why it's been forgotten. But it's important to note that it was a virtual dress rehearsal for Midway. And in fact, this new book on Midway that I just finished up, it starts off with the Indian Ocean raid because there were so many things that were uncannily similar to what happened in Midway. For example, there were bad assumptions on the Japanese part. They had the same lack of imagination and flexibility in their planning and operations. There was Allied code breaking, so the Allies knew that the Japanese were coming, but it didn't quite work out the way either side, predicted. But it's worth looking at that because the same issues that took place in the IO reappeared again in June off Midway. So eventually, by the first week of April, the two sides, the Naval General Staff and the Combined Fleet, came up with a plan what was going to happen in the second operational phase. And what came about was a fatal compromise where both sides got a little bit of what they wanted. Well, a lot of what they wanted. So the Naval General Staff wanted to pursue a strategy to cut off the sea lanes between Australia and the United States, and they got that in this compromise. In fact, that was going to be done first in May, and then after that, Admiral Yamamoto got his way because his goal was to bring about a decisive battle with the Pacific Fleet somewhere in the Central Pacific, and that's where Midway came in. He thought he could use Midway as a lure to get the American fleet to come out of Pearl Harbor and fight a decisive battle with the combined fleet. So this compromise had two phases to it: one, the South Pacific in May, and then the big Midway battle in June. So that's where the Japanese stood after those 6 months. But the Americans were not at all sitting on their hands during this time because despite a lot of the mythology around the Pearl Harbor attack, it in no way crippled the American fleet. The American fleet was virtually intact, and that sounds strange because they did take losses at Pearl Harbor, but the ships that they lost really had no part in the carrier war that was shaping up here in these first few months of the war. So the Americans used their carriers very aggressively, starting out in February. Carrier raids against the Marshalls, the Gilberts. They tried to hit Rabaul on 20 February. That did not work as well as they had hoped. The carrier was discovered early, so the raid was canceled. They hit Wake Island on 24 February. These were pinpricks, though, really, for the most part, didn't really matter much. But the next raid in March in the South Pacific was a bigger deal because when the Japanese landed an invasion force at 2 points in eastern New Guinea on 8 March, 2 days later, two American carriers show up and they attack the Japanese invasion force. So this was a major point because this was the end of the easy Japanese victories in the war. And from this point, the combined fleet would have to give carrier support if the Japanese wanted to advance further in the South Pacific. So that's why there was this argument between the Naval General Staff and the combined fleet. And in April, of course, there was the best known raid was the Tokyo raid in April by two U.S. carriers. But again, there's mythology attached to that because the story goes usually that after this occurred, that's when Yamamoto got his way, and he was allowed to conduct his Midway operation, so he could smash the Pacific Fleet and prevent that raid from happening again. But we just talked about this. The compromise meeting between the Naval General Staff and Yamamoto took place between 2 to 5 April, and the raid took place on 18 April. So that meant that the Tokyo raid, though spectacular as it was and dramatic as it was, had no bearing on whether or not the Japanese were going to attack Midway. That was already decided before the raid took place. And then, of course, in May, we talked about the Japanese intent to move south in the South Pacific, and this occurred in May and resulted in the first carrier battle of the war, Battle of Coral Sea. And this is also a big deal in regards to the Japanese attempt to smash the Pacific Fleet at Midway the next month, because this battle had important implications for Midway. The Japanese brought 3 carriers to bear at Coral Sea, and they lost one of these, a light carrier. The Americans lost a heavy carrier. So most accounts of the battle portray it as a strategic success for the Americans because they stopped the Japanese attack, and that is true, but also as a tactical defeat for the Americans because they lost this heavy carrier and the Japanese lost a light carrier. But the opposite is true. It was a tactical disaster for the Japanese because all 3 carriers that they had in the operation were put out of action, so none of them could take part in the Midway operation. So whereas before Coral Sea, the Americans had a massive disadvantage in fleet carriers, after Coral Sea, they were essentially equal in fleet carriers, and that's where things stood in June at Midway.
Interesting. I always find the kind of Coral Sea and Midway to be interesting because there's been a lot of writing about them, a lot of research about them, a lot of words said about those two battles. But it's really interesting because they are the first big carrier battles, right? So it's they neither side has a lot of experience in the situations that they're in during Coral Sea or Midway.
And the two are very closely tied together. So what you can't look at one or the other in a vacuum. So what happened at Coral Sea had a big impact on what happened to Midway.
Absolutely. Thinking more about Midway, in your book, you kind of dig deep into the assumptions made on the Japanese side as they try and plan for this battle in the Central Pacific. And, every war plan contains its fair share of assumptions around the actions, particularly of the enemy. So, why was it the case that the Midway plans sort of see the Japanese making a lot of assumptions that would almost universally turn out to be wrong?
Yeah, that's a big part of the book. I think one of the most interesting parts of Midway is to look at the Japanese plan in detail. So the book does this in exacting detail because you have to understand the plan to understand what happened in the battle. So as you say, they made a lot of assumptions, and they were universally wrong. And these were our key assumptions to make. And if you get them all wrong, you're going to be in trouble for the actual battle. So just to cover a couple of those key assumptions, they made the assumption, as they did in most of their major operations, they made the assumption that they would gain strategic surprise. So that meant that they would show up off Midway with this big invasion force, and they would have time to take the island and then prepare this elaborate trap for the Americans, because the Americans would not be off of Midway until days after the invasion. So that was a pillar of Japanese planning, and that was very wrong. They made the assumption again that they would also gain tactical surprise. So that meant that they could show up and strike the airfield and knock it out in a single blow. And you look at these assumptions, you wonder why they would make these in view of actual facts on the ground. For example, this tactical surprise assumption, they knew that the Americans were flying long range patrol aircraft off of Midway every day, out for several hours, therefore to extend their ranges. And yet they made the assumption that in spite of that, they were going to gain surprise. And in this Indian Ocean raid, they had made the same assumption, and British flying boats had detected the carriers the day before their first planned raid on a British naval base in the Indian Ocean, at a base on Ceylon. So why would they not learn anything from the Indian Ocean raid, and why would they not use the information they had to make a better assumption? So it's a key thing, because an implication of this assumption they were going to gain tactical surprise was that if you assume there's no Americans off the island, no American fleet units, then why would you conduct a robust search with your own search aircraft to look for ships that weren't there? Well, of course, on the 4th of June, the battle took place. The Americans were there, and the Japanese weren't expecting them, and they weren't looking for them. So it's a key assumption to get wrong. We talked about this single strike assumption, that they were going to knock out Midway and the air power there in one strike. That didn't happen. They assumed that they were going to take the atoll in an amphibious attack in one day. And of course, that assumption was not tested because they didn't try a landing. But the book goes into a lot of detail into the landing that never was. And for a number of reasons laid out, you can't say that it was impossible, because you can't say that there's that much certainty in war. But it was very unlikely the Japanese were going to take Midway ever, much less in one day. So another bad assumption. But the biggest assumption, probably from Yamamoto's standpoint, was the assumption that once the Japanese showed up, took Midway, and set this trap, that the Americans were going to leave Pearl Harbor, recover from their strategic surprise, and leave Pearl Harbor and head to Midway, right into this elaborate trap that Yamamoto had ready for him. So that assumption was not tested because the Americans were already there, obviously, but it's hard to imagine that Admiral Nimitz, who at this point was commander of the Pacific Fleet, would blindly sail into a trap. So a lot of key assumptions here, all of which were very wrong. So why would they do this? I tried to go over this in the book, but there are several key reasons why this was so dramatically wrong for the Japanese. And the big reason, there are two probably, but the one that maybe matters the most was their disdain for intelligence. They just didn't resource intelligence well. They didn't respect the people who practiced intelligence. In fact, the combined fleet had a total of one intelligence officer. So that just shows you how little importance they place on intelligence. And instead of letting intelligence drive operational plans like the Americans did, the Japanese just bent intelligence to conform with their own operational plans. So it didn't matter what the facts were. Like, for example, the Americans were flying patrol boats off of Midway because our plans are not going to be changed by these inconvenient truths. So that's the big thing. And another one was their arrogance at this point in the war. The Japanese trained very, very hard before the war because they were the inferior navy to the Americans numerically. They had to train hard to be ready for this battle against the U.S. Navy. So by training hard, they became very proficient, and they thought they were better than the Americans. But this self-confidence turned to contempt over time. So by the time of Midway, there was deep disdain for the Americans, at least in the command circles of the Imperial Navy. And of course, they had a string of successes until Coral Sea, at least, in the first 6 months of the war. So this view became so prevalent. It was later called victory disease by the Japanese themselves after the battle. So again, they just had no regard for the Americans. So that's probably what drove them to make these erroneous assumptions.
Yeah, and I guess, really digging into some of those assumptions that the Japanese were making and how they came to those assumptions and then the outcome of those assumptions is really important because it sets up so much of the battle, especially when you sort of want to look at why certain things happened. A lot of times that doesn't happen during the battle itself. It happens weeks beforehand when decisions are made about why the Japanese are there and what they're trying to accomplish. Like you mentioned, where they kind of just assumed they would have strategic surprise, and that changes everything about how you're planning for a carrier battle.
Yeah, it does. I mean, you can make the case easily that the Japanese had already laid the ground for their own defeat in the weeks before the battle. And by the time the battle showed up, it was more likely, and the book makes this point, we've gone from books like Miracle at Midway and Incredible Victory, the Americans facing the Japanese juggernaut, and that's turning around, hopefully, and finally. But if you look at all the factors involved here, the plans on both sides, the forces on both sides, the leaders on both sides, it was more likely that the Japanese would lose the battle and instead of them winning the battle. I mean, like, for example, this juggernaut the Japanese brought to bear on Midway, they mismanaged the battle so badly, they planned it so poorly that at the point of contact where the battle took place, they were outnumbered both in terms of ships and aircraft by the Americans. So this huge Japanese fleet didn't matter because most of it never saw any action.
Mm-hmm.
This is Jeff Stein, the host of American Carnage, a new American history podcast which debuted with the epic 5-part story of the radical abolitionist John Brown. We provide the deepest dive you will find anywhere about Brown, and we ask the hardest and the deepest questions that you can ask about his actions. What exactly compelled this man to give away his life in the cause of fighting slavery? What exactly happened on the Kansas prairie one night when 5 pro-slavery men were found chopped to bits? What exactly went wrong for Brown and his men at Harper's Ferry, and how exactly did he change the trajectory of all of American history? We answer these questions, and if you are curious, be sure to check out American Carnage wherever you get your podcast apps.
Hey there, I'm Dylan Lewis, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Money. Each weekday on Motley Fool Money, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights, a long-term perspective on investing, and of course, stock ideas. Plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Yeah. Now, looking at the American side, the carrier aviators of the two task forces involved, 16 and 17, get most of the credit for the events during the battle, as carrier aviators often seem to. But the aircraft stationed on Midway also played a really important role in how things developed. So how did the land-based aircraft based out of Midway sort of impact the overall course of the fighting?
That's a good question because people, like you say, the carrier aviators get all the glory, and people don't really know much or give much importance to what the role of the aviators from Midway was, and they did play an important part of the battle. In fact, it's really hard to imagine that the battle would have turned out as an American victory without the help of the aviators from Midway. So they were a big part of the battle, and Nimitz planned it that way. So he stacked every airplane he could on the atoll before the battle took place. He had like 122, I think, aircraft on the atoll before the battle began, including Air Force bombers, Marine fighters and dive bombers, and there were Navy torpedo bombers. And most importantly, of all those aircraft, there were over 30 PBY Catalina long-range patrol aircraft. So Nimitz's plan was that the aviation from Midway would sink or damage Japanese carriers before the main battle started. So he was banking on some kind of attrition of Japanese carriers before he exposed his own carriers to attack. So in his view, that was a very important part of the battle. But as most people know, there were a series of attacks from Midway, from the aircraft based on Midway, against the Japanese carrier force, and they were unsuccessful, and they took heavy losses. But they did, though they didn't inflict any damage, they did tie up the Japanese carriers for important periods of the battle. So it did restrict what the Japanese commander, Admiral Nagumo, could do. So that was an important part of the battle. But the most important part of the battle that these Midway-based aircraft did was they discovered the Japanese task force. And in fact, when you look at the battle on 4 June, there were only 2 contact reports the entire day that made any difference. And the most important one was the one in the morning from a Midway Catalina. So a Midway Catalina spots the Japanese, and that leads to this series of attacks, first from Midway aircraft, and then the American carriers launched their aircraft based on that single contact report. And later in the morning, they hit the Japanese carriers, and the battle is won effectively by those carrier aviators. But without that contact report, there would have been no strikes. And also, we need to remember the role of the Midway aviators in the actual combat. We talked about the attacks from Midway. They were unsuccessful, but they did tie down Japanese for key moments of the battle. But also, it's also overlooked that there was a massive Japanese air attack on Midway, part of this decisive one blow to knock out Midway's aviation capabilities. In the morning of the 4th of June, the Japanese launched 108 aircraft, and they encountered American fighters based at Midway, but more importantly, a lot of aircraft, anti-aircraft guns were on the atoll, and they were in action. And of the 108 aircraft, 11 shot down, 14 heavily damaged, 29 received lesser damage. That's an incredible rate of attrition. and that couldn't have gone on for many more raids, maybe one more, but not many more than that. And as fate would have it, one of the key squadrons that was involved in the carrier battle later in the day was heavily attrited during this Midway battle. So Japanese took a lot of damage on the 4th of June before the main carrier battle started due to the efforts of Midway.
Yeah, and every aircraft and every pilot that I guess you lose or is damaged or injured over Midway is one less resource that you have during the carrier section of the battle. One of the interesting features of the Second World War, almost universally, is the popularity of discussions around turning points. A search for that one moment where everything changes for whatever nation or for whatever campaign. And Midway always seems to occupy a really important place in those conversations about the Pacific theater. But in your book, you talk about how it's a lot more complicated than that. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd like to, because as you just pointed out, things are complicated. There are no easy answers, to a battle as complex as Midway, certainly. So, as you point out, Midway is often called a turning point, and that's a very vague term. Not clear what a turning point is, but it's true that Midway was a turning point from the standpoint that it did blunt Japanese offensive power. They did lose 4 fleet carriers, and they only had 6 to start with, so that certainly did blunt their offensive strength at that point. But there were many other turning points in the war, and I don't think Midway was the most important turning point. And most accounts of the battle call Midway a decisive battle. And in fact, most of these even go as far as to say that Midway was one of the most decisive naval battles in world history. And that's, I think, a gross exaggeration. First of all, the term decisive battle is misused. It's not clear what that means either. I mean, the term turning point is vague, but even decisive battle is still vague. If you take it literally, it means that this battle determines the outcome of a war. So that's not the case, clearly, because in a major war between industrial powers like Japan and the United States, there's no one battle that decides the fate of a war. If anything, the war is decided by a series of battles that render significant results against one side or the other. And we see that clearly throughout the world wars. There wasn't a one battle that decides the war. So, it's erroneous to call Midway a decisive battle. There were other battles that were more decisive, if you will, than Midway, and these include Guadalcanal. That was the battle started after Midway concluded. So Guadalcanal was a 6-month grinding battle of attrition that the Japanese lost many more aircraft and many more ships than they lost at Midway, and it made the point that the Americans could not be stopped, that their offensive was not going to be stopped. So that was a turning point, certainly. Philippine Sea in June 1944, a turning point, maybe even more decisive from that standpoint, because it was the effective end of the Japanese carrier force. Leyte Gulf in October 1944, again, a turning point, and more decisive, if that's the right term, than Midway. Leyte Gulf was the effective end of the Japanese Navy surface force. So there are other turning points in the battles. And looking at Midway, after the battle in Midway, the Japanese Navy was not crippled. The Japanese carrier force was not crippled. If you look at Guadalcanal, there were several battles. And in fact, most of the battles that were fought off of Guadalcanal were either draws or Japanese victories. And there were 2 carrier battles fought after Midway off Guadalcanal. One was indecisive, it was fought in August, but then there was one fought in October, the Battle of Santa Cruz, that had almost as many carriers as Midway did, and it was a clear Japanese victory. So the Japanese carrier force, which was crippled supposedly at Midway, only a few months later turned the tables and defeats the American carrier force at Santa Cruz. So clearly, Midway was not decisive. And at Midway, the Japanese lost a whopping 5% of their force of naval aviators. So that's not decisive. These same aviators that survived Midway were active at Santa Cruz and did quite well. So if you look at the performance of the Imperial Japanese Navy after Midway, it's clear that Midway was not decisive and wasn't the turning point. I think it's fair to say it was a turning point because it did blunt their offensive momentum, but it was not the turning point of the war.
Do you think some of its reputation might be based around, earlier you mentioned like some books and things written during the war or immediately after? And do you think those have played a part in kind of sort of boosting Midway's reputation as this decisive battle? Because the Americans probably really wanted to say, "Hey, we just won the decisive battle." After
I think clearly that's what happened. The first accounts of the battle written right after the war, and Samuel Eliot Morrison's account of the battle all make that point. And of course, there's a human tendency to portray all events as decisive, and everything is the most important battle for one reason or the other. So, it's a great David and Goliath story that American courage and ingenuity prevails in this decisive victory. But as you said, starting off, it's complicated. There's much more than that when it comes to trying to figure out where Midway should be placed in the series of battles that decided the war in the Pacific.